All right, let's get started. So for this last week, I kind of tasked myself with trying to figure out an efficient way to do crowd simulation in Maya without getting too crazy. So I came across a workflow, and I'll link to the videos that I referenced for this workflow, but it is a pretty basic crowd simulation, but you can kind of make it pretty believable to a certain extent. So I'm going to go over that in this video. First thing that we want to do is set a project. So go to File and Set Project. So set that. And then what we're going to be using as a database is Mixamo animation. So if you're not familiar with Mixamo, let me just pull that up for you right here. So Mixamo is basically a database of characters and animations that are motion capture animation. So it's a very large database, lots of different movements that you can import. And so this is what I'm going to be using for this video. So moving on. So we have our project set, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of setup. So the first thing, I'm going to go in and I'm going to import an FBX. So I'm going to import, we're going to go to assets. We'll go to anim. And then we're going to be using this animation right here, Happy Idle. Whenever you download anything from Mixamo, it's going to be an FBX. And this means that animation, textures, and geometry are going to be basically in one file. So when you import that, it's going to import all of your stuff. And if we play this on the timeline, we can see that we do have some animation going here. For this workflow, for crowd simulation, we're actually going to not use an FBX because we're going to be using Mesh. And so if we used FBX for Mesh, it will slow down the network a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this geometry, and we don't want the joint, so it might be better to select it in the outliner. So select the geometry and then go to cache, Alembic cache, and export selection to Alembic. So you're going to be using an Alembic cache for this. And I've already exported it, but a couple of settings you want to do is make sure it's set to time slider. So whenever you import any FBX animation, your time slider will usually just update to be within that range of animation. So the time should be fine. So just set time slider and then name it. So Happy Idle, and then you would export selection there. So we've already done that. So I'm going to cancel that, and we're going to delete this guy. But I will import kind of our dancing character here. So since I've already baked out this cache, I'm going to just import it here. So import, and right off the bat we have a Alembic cache animation. So I have this kind of dancer here. And I think since, hold on, let me set this to like 200. Just update that. Cool, so we have this cool kind of like breakdance character going on here. So we want to add a crowd around this character. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to group this character and call it dancer cache, just for organization. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to hide this for a second, and we're not going to import any other geometry right now. We're going to do something else first. First thing we're going to do is we're basically going to create a network that will be the data for our crowd. So we're going to basically create location data and orientation data, so that when we import our crowd, the animation for our crowd, we can kind of propagate it around that network. So it'll make sense in a second. So I'm just going to hide this grid, and I'm just going to create a plane. So the important thing about this plane is that it should be one face, and I'm going to make it a triangle just so we have some directionality, because that's going to matter when we orient all of these, our location data. It'll make sense later, but just so you know which way this object is facing. So we have that, and I'm going to select this, and under the animation workspace, we're going to press Mesh and create Mesh Network. Open that option box, and let me just fix that. Yeah, so name this like location data or something. Make sure it's set to mesh, and geometry or distribution type doesn't matter. So apply and close. So now we have our repro mesh. We have our mesh network, and it's the. So I'm gonna just type in mesh here and then exit out just that weird bug just to get open up in here, and you can also open up the mesh editor here. So Perfect. So I'm going to select this distribution node, and I'm going to set the number of points to 0, because we're going to use a placer node to kind of generate our different points where we want our characters to be. So I'm going to create another plane, scale that up really big, just so we have something to work with. And I'm also going to unhide our dancer, so we can see kind of where we want to put our points. So with your network selected, go just over here and create a placer node. Sorry, placer. And what I'm also going to do, I'm just going to select this guy, and we're going to create new material. Let's do a surface shader, and I'll set this to something like blue. Okay, cool. So with that selected, we're basically, let me hide this again. So now we're just going to propagate this piece of geometry around this character. And again, this will make sense in a second. So with the placer node, we're going to add, and I'm going to set this to like 100, so we have a pretty big scene. So, and just kind of, let's do this real quick. Align to mesh, turn off. Perfect. So just kind of go around here and click on points around the character, add some randomization. You don't want it to be perfect. That's kind of the thing about the advantage we have with this workflow, is that the biggest thing that we need to pay attention to is making sure that things aren't uniform, because we are going to be working with basically duplicated animation that we're going to offset. So we want to make sure that this is as random as possible. So that's pretty good. The next thing I'm going to do, we have our points laid out here, so I'm going to go and I'm going to add a orient node. So that's basically going to orient all of our points around a specific place in our scene. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a locator, and we're just going to plug that in to, I'm just going to scale it up. And we'll name this location mesh, just to be more organized. And I'm going to select this, and I'm going to press orient target. Okay, cool. And I'm going to click on the orient again, and under, let's see, aim at target options, just middle mouse, drag it in there. So whenever we move this, it's now going to orient all these points there. Perfect. So I'm going to hide all of this for a second. So now we're ready to create our crowd. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to minimize that, and I'm going to import some more caches. So I'm actually going to go to cache, Alembic cache, import Alembic, and we're going to use this guy, Happy Idle, right here. So we're going to import that. I'm also going to grab this and just group it. So we'll do 0, 1, and cool. So I'm going to hide that for a second, and I'm going to do this 2 more times. Okay, so we have 3 different caches of the same animation, and you might be wondering why we're doing this. Well, we're basically going to propagate each of these animations around this dancer here, but we want to offset the animation so it looks like each version of the animation is moving at different times, right? So that'll make sense a little bit later. So I'm gonna just unhide each one at a time, and since we just need to offset 2 because the one will be at 0. So just select the geometry, and it'll have a node up here, the Alembic node, and you can just go up here. Actually, we do want to loop all of these too, so I'm going to go through and loop all of these, and then just set the offset to something like 50. You know, depending on how long your animation is, you would want to offset to kind of get a different range of poses, right? So we kind of want all of these to look a little bit different. You see how this one's posed is a little bit different now. So just get it offset enough so they're starting at different times, enough that it makes it look a little bit more random. So we're going to select this guy, loop it, set offset to, set that one to 50, we'll set this one to 100, and then this guy, I'm just going to make sure it's looped. Loop. Perfect. So with all these unhidden, we're going to create another mesh network. So select all of these, the groups, go to mesh, create mesh network, and this time we're going to be using an instancer, okay? And I'm just going to rename this crowd data network. Perfect. Distribution type doesn't matter, we're going to change that in a second, and make sure it's instance based. So we're going to hit apply and close, and then we're going to unhide our repro mesh from before. So we're basically going to propagate these animations all around these points here. So I'm going to just type mesh in here real quick so we have this. Perfect. So we're going to select the crowd data network, go over here to distribute, and change it from linear to mesh, right? So this is why we made this one a mesh to begin with, right? So we can input it into the distribute node here. So input mesh, we're just gonna no mouse drag, drop it here, and it's looking a little funky, but we'll change that in a second. So just set the method from scatter to face center. Okay, this is why it's important to just have one face so that you don't have multiple instances being propagated on the same piece of geometry, right? So if you just have one face on the point that you're propagating around your scene, you won't have that issue. So that's good. We'll set the number of points up to so it fills everything. Oh, that one, the center is the original. So I'm just going to hide that guy. Okay, and then we'll do, oops. Let's do one more. Okay, perfect. Now you can see that these meshes are not aligned properly, so we're going to have to change that. So we're going to go back into our location. Oh, you know what? No, here's what we're going to do. We're going to open up unhide this original guy. We're just going to select all these points, and we're going to just rotate it until we get proper positioning. So not that way. The orientation is always a little weird. So we got that, and then this way. Okay. Until you get them looking at the center, right? Cool, here we go. All right. So we're going to hide that again. And if we hide our repro mesh, so we're going to hide our form, we're also going to show our dancer, okay? So now when we play this, we're going to have the start of our crowd sim. As you can see here, all of the characters are animated at the same time, but we do have the placement of these characters pretty good. And if you do need to change this, you can just go back into the placer node. So we'll go into the location data network, open up that placer node, and we'll just unhide the repro mesh so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to hide the crowd just so it doesn't get slow on me. So just open up that, oops, location, placer, and you can select this nudge here, right? We're just going to make our radius really, really big. And you can kind of just, you can kind of just click and drag these and kind of push them around just so that they're not intersecting, right? If you want a little bit more randomness without having to like restart or add more points, you can just kind of, you know, make it a little bit more random and really just kind of sculpt the area that you want them to be in. So I kind of want to push these characters a little bit closer into this, so it's more of a like a house, you know, like a dance floor kind of party thing. So cool, that's good. So I'm going to hide our repro mesh again and pull up our crowd. That's looking a little bit better. Now we do have this issue where all the characters are being animated at the same time. So to fix that, we're going to open up the mesh editor. And under the crowd, I'm going to create a ID node. So we're just going to add that. We're going to set the ID count to 3, which is already set. You want it to be set to as many IDs as many original objects that you created the mesh network out of. And we'll set that to random. Cool, and then let's see how that's going. Cool, so we got something going here. Now, so let me show you one other thing that I'm doing here. I'm just gonna hide our networks. And I'm gonna pull up the original geometry of each character. Oops. So if we go here, I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna click on this geometry. We're gonna create a new material. I'll just do a standard surface and make this like red. And then I'm going to select each of these individual guys. Assign new material, Arnold standard surface, and make this like kind of a muted blue. Maybe bring that blue out a little bit more blue. And then just we'll apply that shader to these other two. Assign existing material, stand surface 2. So now we can hide. So now if we play this back, we have a pretty basic crowd simulation. So what I find this workflow useful for is kind of crowd simulation that that directs an audience's attention away from the crowd. So that it might be a little confusing, but in this case, if I can direct your attention to this character here, you're not going to notice unless you really looked, or unless the shot is too long. You're probably not going to notice that these characters are animated. Just the animation is the same but offset. So that's kind of what I find this workflow useful for, is not for getting super accurate crowd simulation, but to kind of get something in place where it fills up the background to make the kind of the background believable, but not necessarily as a focal point. The other thing I experimented with this workflow is importing multiple animations multiple times to get more just different animations, right? Because if we're using one animation to kind of propagate this entire scene, I kind of found out that if you do that, you need to have the animations be in a very similar pose to each other. All the different animations that you use should kind of have the same stance. Otherwise, it's actually more noticeable that it's a very duplicated crowd simulation. Because let's say that you have one of these characters that you're using, right? One of these animations, this character's hands are above his head. Now, when you propagate over that here, you're going to propagate that exact same pose all the way around here. So if you have all these characters with their arms down and then 4 with their arms up that look exactly the same, it actually makes it look more noticeable. So what I find is that it's the best way to kind of use this workflow is to find animations with very similar poses. So keep that in mind if you do use this workflow. Again, I'll link to the videos that I used as a basis for this workflow in the description if you want to check those out. And yeah, so this was kind of a very quick exploration of basic crowd simulation. I do feel like I learned a lot. I think Mesh is really a tool I'm learning and seeing as something that is very, very powerful in just any field, any area, any portion of the pipeline. So I hope this was helpful. Of course, I'll use for reference later, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.